I wanted to start off by saying that the first thing that my driver told me was that sorry for the smoke. We are in the midst of a wildfire. It started on July 11th, and it is not at all contained. And this past weekend, they started to do evacuations. So literally where we are in the midst of a crisis because there's wildfires literally not too far from where we're sitting. I had left the Bloomberg Green Festival in Seattle on the West Coast and literally was dealing with wildfires there. I had left not too long before that, seeing Las Vegas, in which in Las Vegas and Phoenix, that same week, had gone to temperatures never seen before or recorded before in that area, in which Las Vegas had reached temperatures of 125 degrees. Phoenix had reached temperatures of 124 degrees. The sidewalk temperature had reached temperatures of 163 degrees. That is catastrophic if you're outside. It is something that we can't even begin to get our minds around. It's so much happening that even for those of us who read about this kind of coming, it's overwhelming when we hear about, I know it's dinner time, but this is the spiel to get to where we got to get to. It's overwhelming to have and see people literally in Mecca passing away. It's hard to understand Category 5 hurricanes in June. It's to see the flooding throughout South America and the UK, literally places being washed away. Seeing children, unfortunately, losing their lives because they're literally drowning themselves to get away from heat. We're in a crisis. That's just the reality. We're in the midst of a crisis. And it's something that I think that we as a movement have to have some serious conversations of how we got here. Why we're in the midst of literally folks being climate deniers running for office. That's something that we have, the ball was dropped. So as we get into our conversation today that we're about to have, I do need us not to get into pointing fingers and saying, you know, what's wrong with them. I kind of hope you use this time here to kind of figure out what we need to do better as a movement. What do we need to fund better? Are we funding the right things? Are we broadening our movement? Has our movement been too much looking like the same kind of people preaching to the choir? Are we doing enough right now to bring in more of humanity? Are we being more creative and creating stories? What are we doing? And are we doing enough to save civilization? So before my brother Bill comes up here and we had this conversation, I want to leave you with a story to go into a story, because I figured I wanted to give you something to kind of chew on, to kind of help us. In Queens, New York, anybody here from New York City? All right, there you go. Y'all a long way from home, I get it. All right. It's definitely cooler here in Idaho than it is in New York right now. Sean Bell was killed on his wedding night. He was shot 50 times outside of a strip club, and stories can go any kind of way. That's not the part of this story, but the part of that story that's uncomfortable is that for a lot of people who are from Black, brown, indigenous, queer community, young people, they find that story too often in which their lives are shortened. And so I had to go to Queens. That happened actually November 25th, 2006. About 10 years after that, I had to go to Queens to do, during Earth Day, to give a speech about the climate and the environment. And so I gave it, and I gave that speech and was all fired up and giving it, and I might have been sweating and, who knows, spitting on the mic, all kind of stuff. I'm just excited about saving the planet, what I mean? I'm just getting it in. So this young person comes up to me, couldn't be no more at the time. So in other words, they probably was about 2 or 3 when Sean Bell was killed. And so I'm now meeting them when they're like 12 or 13. They come to me and they go, man, Rev, oh man, that was an amazing speech. Oh my God. Man, I wish more environmentalists looked like you. And I kind of fell for the bait. I'm thinking, I said, yeah, we need to have more people of color and speaking about the climate, I'm thinking, but then what I missed is that I should have caught at that moment that, he had genius outside the academy. I taught at Georgetown, and sometimes when you're in the academy, you think you're really smart, and you forget that there's actually genius, like Ella Baker and folks outside of that, right? And you get caught up thinking that you're so smart. Like sometimes we do in our movement, we're super smart. And I should have heard that this little guy who was 12, 13 was super smart. And then he caught me off guard. And so he asked me this question. So that he says, but yeah, that was great. I said, yeah, we gotta save the planet and how much carbon is in the atmosphere and parts per million and this and that. He goes, but I have to ask you a question. I'm like, yeah, sure, go ahead, ask me a question. He goes, but why do you want to save hell so bad? Why do you want to save hell so bad? And I realized then that to many people, that even if you stop the wildfires and you stop the droughts and you stop the floods and you can curb the sea level rise, for many people who are dealing with poverty and homelessness and lack of education, this is hell. This is hell. And if we do not correct, as my dear friend Leah Thomas would say, correct an intersectional environmental movement that begins to deal with all those things, then we're failing. That's the number one solution, is just connecting the dots between the issues that are affecting people in their regular lives than just what's happening with the climate crisis. But I didn't answer that young person. It caught me off guard, like I'm sure you're now pondering this question of why do we want to save hell so bad? But as time has gone on, I realized that we don't want to save hell. But what we have to do as climate activists is that we have to save hope. That's our job, is to save hope. That people now are giving up hope right now watching conventions. They're giving up hope thinking that it's all is lost, that we're doomed. They're giving up hope, and they're forgetting that it isn't our right or your right or my right to ever give up on fighting for humanity. Humanity is too precious a thing in this galaxy that we should do everything we can. So even when we're no longer here, and they look back on this little plot of land here in Idaho, whatever it's called, and 100 years from now, in 2124, and they look back and they said that there was some kind of thing that Amy pulled together and a bunch of other folks came together to fight. What they will figure out, if we're successful, and none of us are here in if you are here in 2124, you found some really good drugs. Then you hit me up, you know what I'm saying? But what will be here, if they're here, if humans are still here on this beautiful rock 100 years from now, it means that we somehow were successful. If they have clean air and clean water, that means that somehow this band of humans, black, white, brown, red, male, female, straight, gay, this band of humans somehow curbed our addiction to fossil fuels and somehow won. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you, Rev. Thank you. It's a perfect way to start out this conversation. Thank you. And the perfect person to join us to have the continuation of the conversation. I was thinking about what I was going to say, actually not about you. I was thinking about running an environmental political campaign in the 2004 election cycle back then and trying to make climate matter to people and what they prioritize. What I heard from you just now was people have other priorities, other things, and how do we intersectionally solve for those at the same time? And so I was thinking about the work we did to make it relevant to health and to pocketbooks and stuff back in the 20 years ago. And so now we have the perfect person to continue this conversation about this. What are these solutions? How do we find these intersectional opportunities to solve these problems? Bill Weir, Chief Climate Correspondent at CNN, second year at the Sun Valley Forum. Welcome back. We're so happy to have you here, and hear you. And you may have seen Bill's show Wonderlist, and now he's focused on climate solutions, and he will be speaking to us tomorrow morning. Life as We Know It Can Be is his beautiful new book, which I've been enjoying a great deal. Thank you. Mom and I have been listening to it on Audible. We like hearing you as the storyteller. And so thank you for joining us and continuing this important conversation. I'll hand it over.
Okay, thanks. We have three things in common, Reverend. We both have sons named River.
Yes, we do.
Which is very cool.
Kind of weird, though, actually. We both have sons named River, but that's cool, you know what I'm saying?
You were an early hip-hop ambassador to the climate space, and I was the first kid on my block to know all the words to Rapper's Delight by the Sugar Hill Gang, sort of a bridge to that community, as it were, back in the day.
That's another weird fact, actually.
But the other one is that I think Hurricane Katrina was a formative experience for both of us. That was my first big hurricane. I was at ABC News back in the day. I know it's the first time that storm got you thinking about life as we know it.
Yeah, I'm from Louisiana.
Yeah, and changed you now. Looking back, where we are today, 2024, the convention that's happening right now.
Yeah.
How do you feel about the state of organizing around climate in your community? How would you describe it?
So, yeah, I was born Shreveport, Louisiana. Lived right outside of St. James Parish, not too far, which is right in the middle of Cancer Alley, if you know what Cancer Alley is. Cancer Alley is an 85-mile stretch of land. That's just always just depressing to say Cancer anything alley. But it's an 85-mile stretch of land between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, in which there's just a lot of toxic petrochemical facilities on purpose. And it's literally called a sacrifice zone because of the oil and gas communities that are there, creating plastic and fertilizer and things that are just vinyl chloride that are just the worst. So even before Hurricane Katrina, we had companies whose business plan was a death sentence for our community. And so that was the first thing. But when Katrina hit, you have a situation where, again, the most vulnerable were left behind. And I think that's a very important part to the story. What we're talking about here as far as our solutions we need to get to is that there were people who were able to get out of the way for Hurricane Katrina. And then there was some who stayed behind intentionally. I always think about Mama D, who lived on Dergeron Street in the 7th Ward of New Orleans. Beautiful African-American woman with the most amazing great dreadlocks, very petite in stature. But she stayed in her community because she understood that there was mostly elders who lived in her community. And so I bring that story up because when Katrina hit, the ones who were left behind was either sometimes people who were special needs, people who were poor, and our seniors. And what Mama D kind of knew is that if this flood would come, her street was kind of downhill, it could have a bad effect, which it did. And then she began to notice that, this is tough to say, so I just want to say it, apologize if it impacts you, but she began to notice that the seniors who were left behind began to float down the street. And so at first, she didn't know what to do with her and her son. She's in her 60s at the time. She has since passed. She would say it would be heartbreak, because after the storm, people died, but then after, people were still heartbroken. But then her and her son would go out there and really catch her neighbors and start tying them to the tree, these senior citizens. And so I say that because those are the really effects, that nobody should have to catch their neighbors floating down the street to save them from floating away. Those are the impacts of the climate crisis. And so I think that being from Louisiana, in which the fossil fuel industry continues to pollute, that causes the crisis, and then the impacts of the crisis, it is something that then hearing those same industries paying off politicians to continue to pollute, and having backroom conversations in right now in Milwaukee, it's hard. It's hard to just know that these are the kind of conversations that are happening that will be putting forth. It's hard to know that they're putting forth conversations to dismantle the Environmental Protection Agency. It's hard to think about that they're looking to curb the beautiful forestry and mountains that we have to just let it be used in any kind of way. So it's a tough time. And for me, I met my brother Christian, I think earlier, who was also from Louisiana earlier, but I'm former Air Force officer, so I pledged my life to fight for this country. So it's hard to be in a situation when you see your country being the sole root of the crisis for so many people on this planet we live on.
I've been invoking Dr. Martin Luther King a lot lately. I talked about, when I mentioned it in my book, that we lack the capacity to imagine just how bad the nightmares can get on a planet that's woefully out of balance. And I get to go cover these first-hand from Maui to Hurricane Ian or whatever's next this summer. And we remember Dr. King for calling out the nightmares dutifully, but we remember him best for saying, "I have a dream." And I also think we lack the capacity to talk about a sustainable future with boundless, clean energy, healthier, more sustainable, hardier communities, regardless of what comes. We don't tell that story enough. But I'm curious about the story you mentioned earlier. It's even a double lift to get somebody to imagine a better future that they've never even experienced. It's one thing here in Sun Valley where the dream is to hang on to as much of this beauty as we can. It's another thing for kids in Queens who, like my son this morning, it was his first wade in a mountain creek this morning, a really meaningful moment for us. But he's maybe 0.5% of the kids in Brooklyn, from Brooklyn, who got to do that today. You know what I mean? Yeah. So how do you get the community both to connect with nature before it's gone, but also to imagine a much better place and motivate them? Or I guess the bigger question is, what motivates best? Is it the dream? Is it the fear? Is it every sort of color in the crayon emotional box?
Well, I mean, obviously, in the words of Octavia Butler, you have to see yourself in the future. Right, you have to see yourself in the future. And I think that's one of the most important things in that regard. I would also say this thing about Dr. King. So I was obviously mentored by Dr. Dorothy Irene Height, who was led literally the women's movement of color during that time frame. I bring that up because she was not, no woman actually at the March on Washington was allowed to speak. Right? They were only allowed to sing Mahalia Jackson. And I asked her how she felt about that, because she actually was older. She was like, I think in her 40s, and then Dr. King and John Lewis were all like in their 30s and 20s. And so I asked her about that later on, and she was bitter about that. And she said, no, that's one of the reasons why I'm trying to mentor you so you could be better, help your other males out, because y'all don't do well sometimes. And then she also said, though, and then the good Lord allowed me to live long to tell the story. And that's a important piece to this, because I think the goal here is that you can't do this work if you're bitter or jaded or cynical. You can't do it. So no matter what even happens to you. And then the part which you say with Dr. King in that moment about the future, why it's so important, is that yes, he is putting forth this image of I have a dream, that one day, that black children and brown children could all be together, and we'll be free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we'll be free at last. That's important. What I think people miss, and it's important for this moment, kind of what we're juxtaposed to what was happening in other parts of the country, is that in June of that year, Medgar Evers was shot and killed. And they were actually looking to cancel the March on Washington through grief. And they pushed forward regardless of that. And then we know that right after the march was the church bombing, which killed 4 little girls, literally about a month after. So what I'm saying is that in that process, they kept pushing forward, no matter what. And I think that our future has to be a future in which, one, we're pushing forward, no matter what, for clean energy. We have to have a mentality that we are going to have clean air and clean water. We have to have a mentality that regardless of what they're pushing for, the future is one in which is clean and is one in which is sustainable. And so if I can juxtapose the words of Dr. King, I would say that while he said that, which was equality, dealing with that we'd be free at last, thank God Almighty, we will be free at last, I would bring it full circle, because now we're not fighting for equality as much, we're fighting for existence. I would now say that, man, our goal in the future is that our kids, your river, my river, will one day not just say free at last, but our children and your children will say that we are now fossil-free at last. Fossil-free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are fossil-free at last.
I love that. I know you advise the Bloomberg philanthropies. Is it around climate justice primarily,
it's
or
all,
everything? It's everything.
No, it definitely is around.
What are you most excited about? What gets the most bang for your buck when it comes to that future you just described?
It's a lot of bucks. That's the first bang that I like a lot about that. Appreciate Mayor Mike for his contribution. She's a special envoy to climate to the UN. And so I think that there's 2 campaigns I would speak about that are important. One campaign is the Beyond Petrochemical campaign. I think 3 years ago now, he invested $85 million into that campaign, which is designed particularly in my home state of Louisiana, Texas, the Ohio River Valley, of stopping petrochemicals, which, as we know, is the root of plastics. And we have to, I think even I was told here by my sister earlier about this, how we're not using media messaging. We have to do better in that. Like my hat says, for y'all who can't see it, plastics are fossil fuels. We don't even just say that. People don't even know some of the basics of this to even create the solutions. So we are doing everything we can to stop the expansion of petrochemical facilities.
I've heard you talk about 3 prongs, that you use: demonstration, legislation, education.
Yeah.
Is that what you use in this particular?
Well, it's a little fun, but yeah, no, it's demonstration, legislation, litigation.
Litigation, okay.
And you have to use them if you don't want to have frustration. Right? So that's the key thing. I would add a new prong, though, that I think is very important. I would say that the other one that I find that we're at now is around production. I think that we are not using storytelling, and which you're really good at, storytelling and narrative enough. I think that our movement only invests right now 2% of our philanthropy dollars is going into media and storytelling, whereas the fossil fuel industry invests, that we know of, they invest $750 million into storytelling. And so that just shows you the difference, that we are way behind in telling the story. And so I would say that even in our movies, it's been said that that any movie that doesn't discuss climate change is actually a science fiction movie.
It's
so
the new Bechdel test for
it
movies.
is.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
And so I do think that we need to be able to tell more stories. Shout out to Good Energy. Shout out to many of those organizations that are doing great work in that area. I do think that we have to do better at that. I think that's what our major thing. So I think us telling stories, creating content that can help us to broaden the movement, explain what needs to be done as the next steps, so that when we have things like when we say IRA, which is, I think what is Inflation Reduction Act, to the bipartisan infrastructure law, to CHIPS Act, all these things that just seem so foreign, that we are able to then put that into stories and explain things differently.
Totally. You're singing my exact song.
So I just think that we have to do a much better job, and I think that we have a lot of, and you're allowed to use the show, but we have a lot of white paper energy in our movement, where we just bring out, you know what I mean? Y'all know what I mean? And
white paper energy.
Yeah.
I just want to sit on that.
So, yeah, you gotta sit on that one. Yeah.
I love it. Yeah.
But we have that a lot, man. And so it's one of those situations where we think that's gonna be the solution, and people will just read that and they will be like, oh yeah, you're right. And we just gonna just do more of that. And it's not how it works, right? So we gotta figure that part out.
Reverend, it's been great talking to you.
It's been good talking to you too.
I hope to see you around this week.
Thank you.
Reverend Yearwood, everybody.
I'm coming in. Thank you. Thank you, Rev. Thank you. Thank you so much. White paper energy. I was one of those people who's all about the white papers. We give them the facts, they're gonna get it. Nope. No, we got a story. We got to connect. So I'm so excited, bringing back up to the stage Sylvia Earle, Dr. Sylvia Earle, her deepness, Xiye Bastida. We are going to have an intergenerational conversation about life as we know it can be, hosted by the best, Bill. So please join me in welcoming back up Sylvia and Xiye to join Bill.
Hi, Sylvia. Good to see you again. Please. Hi, Xiye. How are you? So I don't know if you will remember this or not, but back in my ABC News days, maybe 15 years ago, we went scuba diving together at the lab down in Key Largo. You know, the Nemo lab that was there? And that was like taking batting practice with Ted Williams. You know, it's just her royal deepness, so it is great to see you again.
It's called the Aquarius.
The Aquarius, exactly. And Xiye, a pleasure to meet you as well. I've been an admirer from afar up until now. So
nice to meet you.
Thanks for being here. Let's talk first, Sylvia, just about your view on the world these days. What are you working on? What do you find is the most effective way to communicate your love of the oceans and really the horrible things that are happening to it?
No child left dry. No grown-up either.
No child left dry. That it's coming.
I think having an experience in some wild place is transformative at any age, in almost any place, whether it's a mountain or a desert or the ocean. It forces you to realize that that's really home. That's home. We have transformed so much of our home into dwellings for primates. I mean, just one species, that would be us. Getting back to reality, go to Antarctica if you possibly can figure out a way to get there. In the 21st century, it's possible. It was late in the 20th century.
Oh, sure. Sorry, let me give you this mic. Sorry.
It was late in the 20th. That's so much better. What's wrong? You need to pass the mic.
I was
Anyway.
hogging the good one. My
Yeah, all right.
apologies. Please.
All right. Well, just that. We need to take care of what remains of what has made Earth habitable. Taken a very long time to get here, a very short time to unravel the very systems that make not just our existence, but how about elephants? How about whales? How about redwood trees? How about all the things that on our watch have really diminished substantially? So it's a reality check.
Xiye, you're from, oh, we could do that one? Yeah. I'm not sure if your mic is working as well. You hold on to that one, Sylvia.
She's from Earth.
From what I understand, I read your essay in All We Can Save, the anthology of great climate essays, and learned that you're from Mexico, indigenous background there as well, and it was droughts and the whiplash between drought and flood that sort of formed your early activism. How would you characterize the state of youth activism these days, right now? The mood, given the politics of the day, and what's happened since the Greta Thunberg Fridays for Future Sunrise movement that was so visible a few years ago?
Does this one work? Amazing. Well, thank you for the question. It's one of the questions I think people have the most curiosity about, because we were everywhere in 2019. 7.4 million youth in the streets across the world in September 2019, and in New York City. Anybody was at any of the strikes? Oh, awesome. Okay, awesome. So 300,000 youth, and with not only youth, people in the streets of New York. And me and 63 other friends organized that. And it was the most amazing thing I've ever been part of, walking down the streets of Wall Street, and the buildings were, reverberating from our chants. And I would say that was the first stage of the youth climate movement, getting the narrative to a point where, why are we in a crisis of such magnitude that the little ones have to tell us that we need to change something? And I think that was a moment of awakening for a lot of people. Why are the kids, the little ones, skipping school, coming out of their high school classes with signs that say, "Where's my future?" And even for me, seeing my own classmates join kind of moved me, because I knew why I cared so much. I cared because my hometown suffered from the climate crisis. My hometown flooded. My parents have been in the climate space for so long. But seeing my peers join in, for me, meant so much, because it meant it was truly a generational awakening as well. The second stage of the climate crisis is kind of this, like us coming to places, sharing our stories. We all started nonprofits, we all joined advisory boards, we all joined all of these other things. But it's not been enough, because we're still, just joining the group of youth that have been doing this for decades. So the question really is, how do we go beyond that? And how can we move away from the youth leadership that's just about advisories and fellowships and mentorships, but true intergenerational decision-making and true intergenerational circles? And I think that's where the third stage of the youth climate movement comes in, which you saw today, is a different type of litigation. And now, maybe it's not going to be against you, because you're all part of our movement, we're all together. But litigation with the big companies that have lied to us, the fossil fuel industry receives $11 million of subsidies every minute equivalent. $11 million of subsidies every single minute. And so the crisis has been engineered, and it has been cemented, and it's been funded. And so the solutions need to be engineered, cemented, funded, and also fought. And I have many friends who are suing everybody, suing companies, suing their countries, and we're creating even new ways of litigation. Me and my friends are working on something called the Future Generations Tribunal to give future generations rights. What would the world look like if 100 years ago I had rights already? If I had right to live within the planetary boundaries? And that is the framework that we're trying to create, so that 100 years from now, my great-grandkids have the right to live within the planetary boundaries. Because that is what has been missing. what is the state in which humans should exist in? What right do we have to clean air and clean water? But not just that, the full systems thinking, including the ocean, including the Arctic. Do I have a right to snow? Do I have a right to winters? So those are the ways that the youth movement has evolved. And many of you might have already hired some of us, but we're still gonna come to the streets if needed.
Let me just follow on that before getting back to Sylvia. Held versus Montana was the state trial that they were successful. The appeal just was heard last week on that. We're waiting to hear that. But there's real fear that the Supreme Court is going to take up the Maui case, a similar youth group suing, I think it's the Hawaii Department of Transportation for violating their rights for not better regulating fossil fuel pollutions. And if that happens, if the court strikes that down, it kills all of these other dozens of cases in states and tribes and cities. Do you think that strategy you're talking about is sort of a constitutional right to a livable planet the way forward? Have you thought about what happens if the United States Supreme Court kills all of these?
I mean, my work is in the international space mostly.
Okay.
But obviously, with the International Court of Justice and other international systems that can help. But we know that those haven't worked. That's why we're in COP30 coming up, COP29. So the United States is definitely one of the main players because the United States leads the way in many, many ways. And so, I am worried that the courts will choose to strike that. And I took an environmental policy class, and we were thinking about what it would look like to have a constitutional amendment for the right of a livable planet. And it's actually really difficult because you have to define livable, you have to define who has right to what. There's so many definitions that go into that. Yeah. The best that I've seen is that current and future generations have the right to a stable environment. And even that can have so many interpretations. So what I really want to tell the courts and people, if I could, would be, you have all this language because at the end of the day you want to find loopholes. What does it look like to have a system that doesn't want loopholes, that actually wants a stable, livable planet? And going back to what Reverend Yearwood talked about with the white papers, my first assignment in my first class of college of my environmental studies class was a white paper. So I just thought that was funny because that is what we're being taught to do, trained to do in school. And we need so much more. The type of imagination and activism that we need is beyond. And I think this is when I want to define activism. I think activism is creativity. I think activism is looking at something, seeing the problem, and thinking, how can it be better? And so if you consider yourself a creative, you're probably an activist because we're dreamers and we're architects. So welcome to the family.
I love that. People ask me all the time, well, what can I do? What are you good at? What do you like to do? Because you can help in so many different ways. You must meet with very influential people who want to understand all you've seen of the oceans and the adventure of your life. What stories do you tell to try to get people to connect to this and really feel what's at stake?
I struggle with this all the time because the evidence is very clear. Earth is an ocean planet. From afar, the world is blue. It has taken quite a while, but I think climate scientists are beginning to acknowledge that it isn't just about the ocean as water, transporting heat and cold. The ocean as a physical phenomenon, of course it is. But rocks and water alone do not make Earth's climate. Earth is alive. Follow the carbon. It'll take you to the trees, it'll take you to the soil, but mostly it takes you to the ocean, and it has not been properly accounted for in our climate deliberations. We're just beginning to think about the ocean as not just the answer, it's the solution. It's the problem as well. We're giving a modest amount of attention to carbon credits for trees, terrestrial systems, but we're subsidizing the extraction of carbon on a mega scale. Fishing. I know it's a sacred thing that you don't talk about, but we have to. With every bite of tuna you take, it's a climate issue. Wake up. You just have to understand. If you don't really understand, then figure it out. Look at the carbon cycle. Kids do it. Where does how is it that the atmosphere exists at all? Photosynthesis, what a miracle. Thank you, photosynthesis, for our existence, because without it, animals couldn't exist. We eat plants, we eat other things, we eat animals. I wish we could photosynthesize. That would solve so many problems. But just think about how much we are extracting out of the ocean, how much has been since the 1950s, when weapons of war, technologies to enable us to wage war on one another, we are so good at doing that, have been turned to wage war on the ocean in a way. Sonar to find and then capture and marketing. If we could just market the truth about what's happening, the ability to really understand the way the world functions. It's not a mystery. I mean, there are a lot of mysteries out there, but the basic cycles, it's the ocean that dominates the oxygen cycle, the carbon cycle, the phosphorus cycle, what keeps us alive. Ocean chemistry underpins planetary chemistry. You mess around with the ocean, and we have been, changing the pH, changing the composition of life, extracting about half of the life out of the ocean, literally since the 1950s, with technologies that enable us to take millions of tons of sharks, of tunas, of you name it. Go to any restaurant, even here, you see octopus, you see tuna, you see a lot of animals that are certainly not native to Idaho on the menu. And because we can extract wildlife on an industrial scale from the sea, doesn't mean that we should. In fact, we ought to rethink what's the real cost in terms of climate, what we're taking out of the ocean. How many trees do we look at and say that's a climate connection? How many fish, squid, shrimp, octopus, all the things that we extract from the ocean? What's the climate cost of what we take out of the ocean, in addition to the climate cost of what we're putting into the ocean? We have the capacity to alter the nature of nature. No other creature has been quite so comprehensively capable, especially in such a short period of time, as our species. So, with that power, we also have the power to make a choice. There are lots of conversations today about what's the future we want. What is the future we choose? I look at you, Xiye, and I think about myself at your stage in life, and how complacent, how unaware, not only I was, but everyone was. No one had been to see Earth from high in the sky. No one had been to the deepest part of the ocean. We could not pick up that little device you hold in your hand and talk to people on the other side of the planet and look at fires in Australia or Canada or in Indonesia and wonder what's the impact on me as well as on them. Never before has there been a better time. I'm so thrilled to see you armed with knowledge that not only did not, but could not exist when I was a child. But you have that power of knowing. And all of the rest of us do too. It's just that you can see your future and wonder, how are you going to stop this decline? I didn't see it as a decline until a few years layered on, and I could see places I knew and loved being converted to human purposes that seemed by some measure to be a good idea at the time to accommodate growing numbers. When I arrived, there were 2 billion people. 4 times that number now exist, with appetites, with needs to have water, a place to stay, recreation, all the things that people need, times 4 from when I was a child. Okay, that trajectory is continuing, but Earth is the same size. We have to come to grips with the carrying capacity and how much we're taking out of the natural systems that we regard as free goods and only think of them as valuable until they're converted to something we can sell. Come on. It's really weird math. We've got to figure it out. We have to look at a tree alive is worth more than a tree turned into board feet of lumber. A fish swimming in the ocean, calculate its carbon value, calculate what it means to your life support system versus, ooh, that's really delicious with lemon slices and butter. I mean, it's a choice. We all have to eat something, but we have so many choices about what to eat. What we are taking, I think that's one of the first lines of where we can really make a difference is what we choose to eat or not.
I will throw out another one from my youth. Xiye, when I was a boy, New York Harbor was basically an open sewer. But through a lot of work of people like you and scientists like you, the Clean Air and Water Acts were passed. And 2 summers ago, a humpback whale swam within a mile of Times Square. The humpback whale comeback is another huge story where we fished this thing to the brink.
Amazing what happens when you stop killing them.
Isn't it? Isn't it? Amazing. Exactly. And we didn't realize that when we did kill 95% of them, we had wiped out the ocean's fertilizer pumps. They go down deep and bring up all this nutrients.
Carbon cycle.
Exactly. So there are literally our biggest allies in carbon capture, the humpback whale. Thank goodness we didn't kill them all.
Think about squid, tuna. Every living thing in the ocean is part of that carbon cycle.
Exactly. They're the big ones, though, right? The whales. But I'm with you. But again, that started with telling a different story about what if we could kayak in New York Harbor? What if we could bring the oysters back? What if we could bring back the humpback whale? And it starts with folks like you telling a better story and coming together. We have that capacity. So thank you both. To be continued. We'll see you guys in the morning. Have a great night together. Oh, Amy's coming back up.
Thank you all so much. Please join me again, another round of applause for these three and for Rev Yearwood. Thank you. Thank you so much.